If you're a guest of ours today, I would like to say that we are so glad to host you this morning on Easter Sunday. Thank you for choosing friendship to worship. I would like to say one thing real quick. You'll notice in your handout that it says, I think, something like, it would have been Easter. It should say, it would have been easier. That will play into it in just a little while. But I also want to let you know that if you're a guest of ours today, that there are many times that, I just don't like monologues. And so we'll have dialogue. So if I ask you a question and you realize I'm not answering it, it's because I'm waiting on you to answer it. And so if somebody doesn't answer it, then we're going to be really late one day. So just to let you know that. But today it's going to work a little bit differently, because what's going to happen today is you're going to be prompted. There are going to be times in the message where I'm going to say the word resurrection, and then when I point to you, only when I say resurrection and point, it's an and situation, then I want you to say resurrection. You want to give it a try? Resurrection. A little bit lower. Resurrection. Now, that's a topic that's a whole lot easier to talk about than it is to do. This resurrection stuff is really kind of a complex thing, and I found myself trying to make a decision hinged on that very fact early in my ministry. I was serving a small country church where the closest visitors were cows. We got to watch a horse give birth to a little horse, which was pretty awesome. You think, how did that work? That thing was, anyway. And so, God is awesome. God is awesome. But I found myself in my home thinking about that whole resurrection thing because I had received a phone call. And on the other end of that phone call was a man saying, Tony, I would like to know, turns out he was a minister, if you would be willing to come and serve as my associate at this particular church. And the first thing that popped in my mind, why in the world would you be calling me? Why me? And then I started thinking, the second thing was, this is one of my minister friends, because we'll do this kind of stuff, pulling a prank on me. He's trying to punk me to see if I'll call back and get all involved and all of this stuff. And so being the young, wise man that I was, I decided that I would tell them, no, I can't call you back right now, but let me call you back in a little while, because that way, you see, I've tricked them. Because now when I call the number back that they give me, there better be a secretary answering with the church name that they just said they were from. And so while I sat there and contemplated whether this might be real or not, I also thought about, what do you mean calling me? You see, we don't work on a call system. In fact, bishops send us to churches. By the way, and I didn't want to say this, but Steve said that I needed to. As of this Sunday, I've been here just a little bit over a year, and will be here another 6 years guaranteed. And so, be careful what you ask for. And so, I'm sitting there thinking all of this stuff, and I started to contemplate what had brought me to the church that I was currently serving before I made this phone call. And I started to think it's a dying church. I was sent there because it was a dying church. They had an older minister that was serving there, and it really wasn't a good fit, and things were starting to go downhill. So they thought, you know what? What we need is a change in the pastorate, and then things would be better. They felt like if they just stayed the course and I did what I was paid to do, then by myself that I could resurrect this dying church. And they felt like there was no need to change, that they would just keep methodically plodding along into the future, and lo and behold, something would happen. And it seemed like the messages that I was preaching on spiritual growth, discipleship, tithing, building relationships, and funding ministries, but most of all, building relationships outside the church, where one day maybe somebody might ask us, why are you different? And then be able to share Jesus with them. They weren't getting all of that. And so I felt like all those messages were falling on rocky soil. And this left them trying to figure out why things still weren't turning around. You see, when I arrived, they talked a lot about resurrection. They wanted to be as alive and vibrant as they once were. And I'm talking about just a few years before I got there. But once I arrived, they realized this resurrection stuff was a little more complex than what they had first thought. Because with resurrection comes choices and consequences, and therefore accountability. Resurrection, talking about it and actually doing it, proved to be two separate issues. I checked on this church just a few months ago to see how they were doing. As it turns out that the membership had dropped so much that they could no longer afford to pay their minister, and so they had to go in with another church so that they could afford to fund ministries. Now they only had a minister half the time that they had before, and perhaps we're still wondering why we aren't growing. Why isn't there more spiritual stuff happening? Why aren't we out in the community more than we once were? Why aren't we building relationships outside the church walls so that we're not just another civic club, but we're this thing called the church? Resurrection. Other churches have been a different story. Other churches have understood what a resurrection meant. They understood the complexity. They understood what it meant to get after it and to take the gospel seriously. And they were willing to do whatever they could. Whatever they were able to do, they would do it. Growing spiritually, making disciples, funding ministries, and developing relationships outside the church walls so that people were asking them, why are you different? They had an opportunity to share Christ with them. At one church, I remember we were sitting down just talking about it. Somebody had invited us over to eat. By the way, if you want to do that, T-bone steak works out real well. And you don't even have to like me. I'll just come over and just sit and eat T-bone. And so we're over there eating, and they started to ask me about the Natchez Trace. Now, they knew that I love riding bicycles and hiking and being outdoors and all that stuff. How many of you have ever been to the Natchez Trace? Familiar with it? This was the part that was just outside of Florence. And they said there's a certain place on the Natchez Trace that if you go there at just the right time, then you will see this incredible happening. Now, for you that are biology freaks, do we have any biology freaks here today that'd be willing to raise their hand? Because what, Caleb? So now, what I'm going to tell you isn't exactly right, but work with me because it'll make more sense. But they said there's a place on the Natchez Trace that if you go at just the right time of year, that you will see these beautiful monarch butterflies by the thousands. But you've got to go at just the right time. Now, you want to talk about a resurrection? You take that caterpillar that starts weaving that cocoon. I think it's a chrysalis, actually. Caleb, am I right? It's a chrysalis. Just nod your head because you weren't paying attention. You were talking. I saw you. And so now, don't think I can't see to the back row from up here. But it's spinning around the caterpillar, and before you know it, the caterpillar is totally entombed within this cocoon. But then there comes a point where it comes out, and it's something much more beautiful than it ever entered into. Sound familiar? Resurrection. Perhaps one of the greatest resurrection stories told of all time. No, it was the greatest story told of all time. The resurrection of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. And I want you to read that with me now. Go to Matthew, the 28th chapter. We're going to be looking at verses 1 through 8. You can watch it on your phone. You can watch it on the screen. You can read it from a leather-bound, paper-bound. If you don't have a Bible, you can get one when you come in. If you don't own one, you can take it when you leave. I always joke around. It's kind of an old joke now, but if you've got a Bible like mine, page 1489. I'll be reading for the New International Version, and this is what it says. After the Sabbath at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, and an angel of the Lord came down from heaven, and going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. I want you to listen to the next part. The guards were so afraid of him that they shook and became like dead men, which is going to be ironic when you read the next statement. The angel said to the women, "Don't be afraid." Just those great warriors that were out there are standing around like dead men because they're so scared. But you guys, don't be afraid. For I know that you are looking for Jesus who was crucified. He is not here. He is risen, just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee, where there you will see him. Now I have told you. May God add rich blessings to the reading of His holy word. Just like me on the Natchez Trace, I've often wondered when I got there and I didn't see any of the butterflies, I wonder how close they were to seeing the stone rolled away, to see something that had entered into this tomb so different than the way he left, and I wondered how close they were. Now, by the way, you realize that the stone was rolled away not so Jesus could get out, but so we could get in? Jesus can get through stones because He's gotten through my heart. There have been times when it was harder than stone. But I received a resurrection. I wonder how close they actually were. And have you ever thought about how much easier life would have been for them if they had found Jesus still in the tomb? How easier it would have been, because now they've been told, go out and tell. Now, I don't know if you really take this into consideration, but sometimes we just read over Scripture like it's not real, like we've heard it so many times, no big deal, right? Think about if you had gone to Spry Funeral Home this week to a funeral. You walked up to the casket. You knew they were dead. You looked in it. And then you went to graveside. And then maybe a few days later, maybe 3, I don't know, you decided to go back and place a rose on that grave, and you went up to it and you realized, uh-oh, they're not there. Now imagine how that would have felt to go out and tell your best friend. They're going to think you've been drinking. They're going to think you are some kind of kook. And once again, you may be, but not because of that. They're not there. Can you imagine what it was like to have to go tell their friends? Can you imagine the reputation to go out and say, there was a guy that was dead, I saw it myself, we put him in there, and he's not there. And this angel, I mean, don't forget that part of it, has said he is risen. Oh, it would have been easier. It would have been easier to just talk about the resurrection than it would be to go out and deal with the choices and the consequences and the eventual accountability that it actually meant. It would have been easier for Peter, who just days earlier, at a time when Jesus needed him the most, he said, I will never drop my commitment to you, Jesus, no matter what. And yet the next thing he knows, he's denied Jesus not once, not twice, but 3 times before the rooster had crowed once. See, it would have been easier for him if Jesus still laid in the tomb, because with enough counseling and enough talking to his good friends, he might be able to find a way to forgive himself from what he had done to Christ. And I wondered, when he found out that Christ was alive, if he didn't do the traditional, uh-oh, this isn't going to work out well. It would have been easier for Pilate, who also knew that now that Jesus was alive, that he had just let a guy go by the name of Barabbas, who was a known murderer, while at the same time he let an innocent man die on the cross. You know, maybe with a little help, he too might be able to find a way to forgive himself, but now he knew that he was going to be held accountable. It would have been easier for the disciples. Then maybe days later, they wouldn't have to explain, when they found out that Jesus was alive, why they were all holed up in this room behind locked doors, when Jesus had given them clear instructions, go out and do my work. And then there was Thomas. I'm sure he got the biggest, because he had heard the story from the other disciples, and he says, I will need some proof. Can you imagine when he saw Jesus, and Jesus holds out a hand with a hole in it and says, go ahead, poke your finger through it. I'm sure he at that point said, I got nothing. I've got nothing. It would have been easier, because you see, then he knew that he would be held accountable. Because with the resurrection comes choices and consequences, and ultimately to know that we will be held accountable. Resurrection. It would have been easier. You see, the result of the resurrection is it creates choices and consequences which we will be held accountable. It would have been easier for Peter. It would have been easier for Pilate. It would have been easier for the disciples. And it would have been easier for us if they had just found Jesus in the tomb that day. because then it would be easier to overlook the needy in Athens. It would be easier to overlook the homeless, the hungry, the naked. It would have been easier to sleep in on second Saturdays when we go out and impact the community. It would have been easier to overlook the importance of Sunday morning worship and to forget about the 10 Commandments if Jesus had still been in the tomb where Christ comes and God, with the written tablet, I should say, says, I'm a jealous God and I command your worship weekly. It would have been easier. And it would have been easier to overlook our financial contributions and funding ministry and keeping ministry alive in all the churches we've ever served if Jesus had just stayed in the tomb. It would have been easier to overlook getting involved in the communal life of the church through small groups and Wednesday night groups and groups that meet outside the church. It would have been easier to overlook the fact that maybe we don't feel comfortable with going out and creating relationships with others in our community that aren't within the church. To develop those relationships to the point where they say, you know what, you're different, and I want to be like you. How did that happen? And you share Jesus Christ with them and share the church with them. It would have been easier. It would have been easier to overlook our membership vows that you just heard earlier. Prayers, presence, gifts, service, and witness. To forget that it's not a smorgasbord that I can just pick one off the other and go to the next. It would have been easier to overlook, and you can fill in the blank. Because you see, we all have a space within our hearts that we just wish Jesus would overlook. It may not be something large. It may be something small. It may not be something small. It may be something large. But when they arrived at the tomb on the first day of the week, the tomb was empty. Jesus had been resurrected. God had done something wonderful. But as wonderful as it was, it also created choices and consequences. And then we knew we would be held accountable. But if you don't hear anything else today, hear this. That's not the end of the story. You see, if we just focused on all that stuff that I just talked about, quite honestly, today could become a real bummer, right? Because we know we all have those places in our lives that need to be resurrected. And I don't want you to leave here today after buying all your new clothes and leaving all bummed out. That wouldn't be any fun, would it? I don't want you to go eat your Easter lunch feeling like the life has been sucked out of you, where you've got indigestion thinking, wow, I thought we were coming to hear that lambs and bunny stuff. It's Easter, and the preacher gave me a fat lip. We don't want you leaving like that. You see, the resurrection's not the end of the story, and that's what you've come to hear today. And that's what I'm about to tell you. It's not the end of the story. It means that a new life is possible, and that for everybody in here, there is some part of our life, more than likely, that needs to be resurrected. And Jesus has come to tell you today that that can happen, and it can start today. And for many, a resurrected life is just what you're needing. And with that in mind, we're going to start a new series. In fact, we're going to start a new series. Today's kind of the intro to it, but it's going to start next week, and it's for everybody. It's for those people that are living a wonderful life, the kind that we deep down think, how do they do that? You talk to them, and their life is going too good. What's up with that? Mine can't seem to match theirs. It's also for those that are struggling with life. This series will be about those that want to have a better relation with Jesus and a better relationship with others. It's about those that have been successful and not so successful. And it's about those who want to say once and for all, I want to make Jesus Christ Lord of my life, put Him first, and to say, you know what, I'm Tony Johnson, and I am second. So no matter who you are or where you are in life, I think this series called I Am Second will give you hope, and I think you will leave better because of it. A better person. Because it's for anybody that needs a resurrection. And I've never met anybody that doesn't need to be resurrected in some part of their life because of some part of their past. Maybe your life has just been successful to no end. You don't even know what to do with it all. Maybe it's been so much of a failure that you don't know where it's going to end. But either way, it's going to be a possibility to come and hear how you can make Jesus Lord of your life and potentially turn all of that around. No matter how good it is, it can be better. No matter how bad it is, it can be greater. All because of the resurrection. Resurrection. Maybe your life is more like Mike, who found out that his life was kind of a mess. Maybe your life was great, but I run into more Mikes than I do those that have things going so well they never need any help with anything. But Mike says he has a confession. He says, my life is a mess. After 45 years of trying to follow Jesus, I keep losing Him in the crowded busyness of life. I know that Jesus is somewhere, but it's difficult to make Him out in the haze of everyday life. Anybody ever been there? You've got so much going on that sometimes we lose where Jesus is. For as long as I can remember, I've wanted to be a godly person, a better person than I am. Yet when I look at the yesterdays of my life, what I see mostly is a broken, irregular path littered with mistakes and failures. I had temporary success and isolated moments of closeness with God, but I long for the continuing presence of God. Most of the moments of my life seem hopelessly tangled in a web of obligation and distractions. I want to be a good person. I don't want to fail. I want to learn from my mistakes, to rid myself of distractions and run into the arms of Jesus. Most of the time, however, I feel like I'm running away from Jesus into the arms of my own clutteredness. I want desperately to know God better. I want to be consistent. Who I am and who I want to be aren't very close together at all. Now, don't get me wrong, I don't want to be St. John of the Cross or Billy Graham. I just want to have more victories than defeats, yet here I am, almost 60 years old, and I fail on a regular basis. If I were to die today, I'd be nervous about what people might say at my funeral. Anybody in there be nervous about what people might say at your funeral? He says, I'd be happy with something even like, well, he was a nice guy. Or even I'd be happy if they said something like, he was occasionally decent. We've done that on purpose. Don't think, hey, it's the white light, the resurrection. You have to pay attention now. Resurrection. And we had it programmed to go straight to Jody. How's it looking? There we go. It's just like we planned it. Good. But old Mike's life was such a mess. He finally came down to this. He wished that somebody might say something like this at his funeral, like, well, Mike wasn't as bad as a lot of other people I know. Unfortunately, eulogies are delivered by people who know the dead. I'm sure the consensus would be, Mike's life was a mess. His life was a mess. It would have been easier, but it wouldn't have been better, because that morning God did something wonderful. The tomb was empty. Christ is alive. And for those lives who couldn't be any better, and for those whose lives are a mess, does God have anything to say to you? Does God have anything to say to the successful and also to the Mikes of this world? To those that would like to say, Jesus, you are Lord and I am second? Yes, He does. He has something to say to all of us this morning. And it's this. And this time I want you to say it really loud. Resurrection.
I think the emptiness happens when you get to the place that you thought would make you happy and you discover it doesn't. Or the emptiness happens when you continually strive to get to that place and don't quite reach it. It's two different kinds of emptiness, but it's emptiness nevertheless.
felt desperate.
Terrified.
It was lonely.
It was chaos.
Such a disaster.
And is this it? Is this who I am?
Why am I the one who has to be different?
I was literally becoming two different people. I hated what I was doing.
Possession, trafficking.
I'm getting suicidal.
I don't want to do
I couldn't get any more.
I can't stop.
I hated myself.
I just wanted her dead.
Inside of me was dying.
I can't do this. I would just cry and cry and cry and cry and cry. All I wanted was to be loved.